We're good.
All right, everyone, good evening. Welcome to tonight's Education Town Hall. My name is David Olson, and it's my honor to serve as State Representative for Illinois' 81st District. I'm very pleased to be hosting this event tonight with our State Senator, John Curran from the 41st District. Appreciate him co-hosting this event with us. Tonight we're really thrilled to have two representatives of the Illinois State Board of Education with us. We have Ray Clements, the Director of Assessment and Accountability, with us today. She is an expert on the major topic of this forum tonight, educational assessment. We also have Sarah Hartwig, Director of Legislative Affairs for the State Board of Education. And I'm so pleased to see in the audience that we have many leaders in our schools, and school board members, teachers, and many parents. I think that it's important that we set the stage here for this event in order to respect the time for all of you and to make the most of our limited time here with the State Board of Education. We're going to keep tonight's discussion focused on our topic here, education. Many of you may wish to discuss other topics with me or with Senator Curran, and of course we're happy to do so at another time. My assistant, Lynn Byla, is in the back, my legislative aide, and she has cards for me. Senator Curran's assistant, Eileen Minahan, is I think at the table, and our cards are in the back, so please feel free if you want to discuss other topics outside of the scope of tonight's meeting. Please feel free to reach out to us, and we'd be happy to set up a separate time to do so. I want to also explain some of the format. As you can see, we're already collecting note cards. Questions will be moderated, and I appreciate Sarah's help in moderating the questions. If you have questions, please write them down on the note cards. Sarah will then moderate the discussion after we hear from Ray with some opening remarks. I want to just also say that we may not have time to get to all questions, so please, if you'd like to have follow-up outside of tonight's meeting, please include your name and email, and we'd be happy to follow up if we're unable to get to your question. I do want to especially thank the State Board of Education, Ray and Sarah, for taking this time to be in Downers Grove and in the 81st Representative District, 41st Senate District, to talk directly and so you can hear directly from them. This is such a critical topic, and we really appreciate your opportunity, you coming and hearing from them, but we appreciate them taking their time to be with us tonight. This is an important, educational assessment is a critical topic in our community. It's something I've been hearing from parents since I started in office in 2016. I've had discussions with superintendents, teachers, parents, and people from all across the district about this important topic, and given some input to the State Board of Education as they've explored the topics, especially around park testing. So I look forward to tonight's discussion where we have an opportunity to hear directly from the State Board, as well as share some of our feedback here from the community. Again, thank you very much for coming, and I'd like to introduce Senator John Curran to make some opening remarks. Senator Curran.
Thank you, Representative Olson. I'll be very brief. I just want to thank everyone for coming out tonight. I think we have a topic that is of great interest in our community. You know, I'm a parent with one girl in high school, 3 girls in elementary school here in District 58, and a preschooler that's going to be going through both eventually. So this is a topic that I share a tremendous interest in terms of testing and assessment of our children in school. So thank you again for appearing tonight. I do want to let you know, reemphasize what Representative Olson mentioned. It's a work night, it's a school night. So we do have this set to 8 o'clock. We probably will not get through every question. So please put your contact information on any note card. If you go home and you think of something afterwards, please contact one of our offices and we will get answers to each and every question. That is the goal here tonight, is to get maximum information out on this topic. And we will also have this up online as well if you wish to review or refresh afterwards. So with that, we are going to kick it off and with the State Board of Education.
Thank you. My name is Ray Clements, and like I said, I'm the Director of Assessment and Accountability at the Illinois State Board of Education. And I took the job somewhat recently, and people were saying, "Oh, congratulations!" And I'm like, "No. I just signed up to be the third most hated person in the state, behind whoever's in charge of the DMV and whoever is governor." So we're good. It's going to be a fun time tonight, I think, and a great conversation. If I can wake my mouse up. All right, so just a few brief opening remarks. I'd like to leave most of the time for questions. But again, understanding that at ISBE, we are about equity and the whole child. And what assessment provides us is a common language with common understandings. And our state superintendent says it really, really, really well. It's like in sports. You have to kind of have a common standard. And a kid may do really well in their regional area, but then when they go all state, all of a sudden the standard is a little higher. So it's important to have these common standards that help us understand how we're really doing. Again, design principles for best assessment for Illinois students. I mean, what we're really trying to get at here is what is the best available assessment science. And again, reasonable people can reasonably disagree about what that is. But we are committed to always trying to have the best assessments for Illinois students that we can possibly do within the guidelines that the federal government gives us. We don't get to just pick any test we want. The tests we pick have to meet the federal guidelines. And I know there was a lot of attention about ESSA and some of the regulations with ESSA, that ESSA being the Every Student Succeeds Act. I have to remember my acronyms because there are a lot of them in assessment, aren't there? With the Every Student Succeeds Act, there were a lot of flexibilities that opened up in that, and that got people really excited. And then I have to dash their hopes when I say, yeah, but all the regs about assessments, those didn't go away. So we're still kind of operating under the same expectations when it comes to that. And then again, ongoing engagement and relationship. And that's why I'm really actually very excited to be here tonight, because I really do love answering questions about assessment, not being sarcastic about that. So I do want to just take us on a brief history from history to here, because this all started, this whole, obviously standardized testing started under NCLB, but really for us, and the journey to where we are now began with the new Illinois Learning Standards. And that really was something that was incredibly collaborative. It was one of the largest collaborative efforts to set standards for education in the country. And it really involved parents, it involved students, teachers, legislators, business people, basically asking that question: what would it look like for a kid to leave high school, college, and career ready? How do we address the problem that too many of our kids go into college needing remedial education, and that costs them money, it costs their parents money, it costs our communities and time and resources? How can we address that issue? And once we got the standards, then everybody looked around and went, well, wait, we don't have an assessment that's really aligned to these standards. It doesn't really measure the things we said were so important. How do we build a test that does that? And so again, how we got to here was a long process with a lot of educators saying, boy, if I were in charge of designing the state's test, this is what it would look like. And that is one of the things that PARC did really, really well. They truly engaged educators and asked them, what would your ideal assessment look like? So I do want to cover some of those federal assessment requirements, just so that everybody knows what they are. We are required to annually assess students in grades 3 through 8, and at least once in high school, for ELA, which is Reading and Language Arts, and Mathematics. In science, we are required to assess once in grades 3 through 5, once in grades 6 through 8, and again once in high school. The tests have to be aligned to high academic standards. And there's actually two pieces to that. The state has something called a peer review process, and they both review the standards to make sure that they're rigorous enough, and they review the assessments. And those peer reviews are not a bunch of, necessarily eggheads sitting around in Washington. They are, again, educators from all around the country that do that peer review. That's why they call it peer review. The tests have to be reliable, valid, and fair. And there are actually something called the educational testing standards that sort of set out what those things mean. And I do have to say that sometimes that gets hard for people, because when psychometricians and scientists and educational testing people talk about valid, reliable, and fair, those have meanings in a statistical sense that are different from how we kind of understand and feel fair and valid and reliable in our day-to-day life. And so I always like to kind of unpack what those things mean a little bit. They have to be administered securely and consistently. Again, making sure that everyone's testing experience is as close to common as possible. Can't be perfectly possible, but as close to possible, and to all public school students. And that includes students who are served in other schools. So if you have a student who has been outplaced somewhere, that student is still a public school student. They're just being taught somewhere else. It includes kids in charter schools. Okay? All right, so the required tests in Illinois are the PARCC, which is soon to become the Illinois Assessment of Readiness, or the DLMAA, which is the Dynamic Learning Maps Alternate Assessment. So most of the kids take the PARCC. DLM is the test for the kids who have the most severe cognitive disabilities, the 1% of kids. At high school, we presently have the SAT. There is an open procurement. I do not know what test we will have next year. I truly do not. So right now it's the SAT. We know next year it will be a nationally recognized college entrance exam and a set of aligned assessments at grades 9 and 10. The Illinois Science Assessment, the ISA, is the test that we have. I'm sure there are lots of questions about that. That is a homegrown test that we built because the feds said we took a year off of science, and they were not happy with that. And so we had to put a test together. We did. We took items from DC, and that's what kids have been taking. But we are in the process right now of building what we hope will be the best science assessment in the country, and I cannot tell you how pleased I am that so many science educators have said, I would love to be a part of designing and building this assessment. There is so much enthusiasm, and it's a real challenge. States all over the country right now are asking themselves, what would a truly three-dimensional science assessment look like? Because the science standards are really huge and broad and dynamic. And they really encourage a lot of critical thinking. And so how to measure that and measure it well is a real challenge that every state is grappling with. So we are excited to be a part of that work. Our students who are English learners have to be assessed annually for their English language proficiency. This is the test that helps determine whether or not they still need services. That is the access test. And then the other required assessment, not actually run out of my division, but I think it would be fun, the Illinois Physical Fitness Assessment. And that is all students in grades 3 through 12. One thing to bear in mind, because I know, I get it, testing seems to take a lot of time, and it does. But it's actually only less than 1% of the entire school year. It really is. Less than 1% of the school year is spent on required assessment. All right, so there's also, I just wanted to kind of talk about some of the new requirements in ESSA and why those are driving our approach to improving on the PARCC assessment. Providing individual student interpretive, descriptive, and diagnostic reports that allow parents, teachers, principals, and other school leaders to understand and address the specific academic needs of students, and that are provided to parents, teachers, and school leaders as soon as is practicable after the assessment is given in an understandable and uniform format, and to the extent practicable in a language that parents can understand. That is directly out of the Every Student Succeeds Act. And we are aware that the PARC assessment and the PARC reports, as they exist right now, we don't think completely fulfill that. And so, again, PARC itself as a consortium is working to improve their reports, but we also think we want to take that in a new direction as well. So our goal is to build an aligned system of assessments, right? The idea is that the assessments that a kid is doing in 3-8 speak to and tell us something about how they're going to do in high school, and that they can be in conversation with the other assessments that districts are using. One of the things that I have on my wall in my office is this statement. A test that tries to be all things to all people is going to do none of them well. And that is a true statement, and if you talk to people who design tests, they're always going to tell you that. No test is going to give you all the information you could possibly need and want about a child. And it's always just a moment on a day, right? It tells us a lot of really important things. It allows us to make a lot of really important decisions, but it can never be all things to all people. And so we always want to bear in mind what the purpose of the state's accountability assessment is. ESTA says we have to do those things, but we also have to bear in mind that a big part of that is to help us understand how we can support our schools. We need to know which schools and which students are being best served and those that are being underserved, and make sure that we are supporting schools, districts, teachers, administrators in addressing those student needs. Again, we want to align vertically and horizontally, so across reading, math, science, and again, providing information to educators, administrators, parents, and students more rapidly. We understand that waiting until the school is out is just not soon enough. We get that. We have to be committed to maintaining high standards of rigor. Now, love or hate PARC, but it truly does set an incredibly high bar, and it is one of the only tests that truly requires a student to demonstrate what they know and what they can do with what they know, not just recall of facts and figures. That's important, but it's not the skill set that they need when they go out into the world. The biggest thing they need is the ability to communicate, both orally and in writing, and most especially in writing. Think about how much writing we do on a day-to-day basis. It's astonishing. So making sure that our students have that ability to communicate effectively is just critical to their future success. And the PARC test and the PARC items are really unique in how much constructed writing and how much reasoning they really require. It's the reason that the PARC assessment is the only test right now to be recognized by the federal government as fully meeting the federal assessment guidelines. So, I mean, it really has been recognized as having an incredible, quality and rigor. We also have to maintain comparability, and this is really important because, again, schools need longitudinal data to help them make informed decisions about their curriculum and about how effective their practices are. Same way we look at this data to understand practices statewide, they're looking at their data to understand practices locally. So, we presently have an RFP, it has not yet been released, it's been approved by our board, that has some priorities. We intend to build and use the PARC items, but put them together in new and different ways so that we can accomplish the following things. We need to be able to return machine scorable results. Those are things that a computer can grade within 1 week of the test window closing. We need to be able to return hand-scored results within 1 month, right? Those are the items that have to be read by an actual person, need some judgment associated with them. We need better reporting options for teachers and parents. The standards are very complex, and so we need data that speaks to the standards in a more granular way. We need native language assessment development. At the end of the day, we have a growing body of students for which English is not their native language, and to really understand what they know and can do, we need to be able to let them do that in a language they can access. And then finally, we need to transition to a computer adaptive test. There's a lot of sense that computer adaptive is better at telling us how far a student can go up or how, where their sort of deficiencies are. Now, there are some challenges associated with that. That you have to assess a student on their actual grade level content and grade level standards. But just because it's hard to do doesn't mean it's not the right thing to do. So, with that in mind, I would love to open it up to some of your questions. Sarah?
All right, thank you, Ray. As Representative Olson said, my name is Sarah Hartwig. I'm the Director of Legislative Affairs for the State Board of Education. I also want to remind you that Ray is here on her birthday, not only just a birthday, but 40th birthday. So thank you for coming to beautiful Denver. Okay, so like the Senator and Representative had said, we're going to try to get through as many questions as possible relating to assessments first. We did get a bunch of questions that are outside of assessments, education related, so we'll do assessment first, try to get to the other ones. Emails are on here, so thank you so much. Thank you. And we will work with the legislators to get responses. So the first question, and this is for Ray, but I welcome the legislators to jump in. Why does the State Board not recognize a parent's constitutional rights to guide their child's education? And I believe this is related to having a child refuse the test.
Great. So, at the end of the day, your constitutional right is to have your child either receive a public education or to not receive a public education. Within that, you don't get to opt out of the sort of instructional program. And assessment is just one small piece of that instructional program. I mean, I hate to say it, because I didn't like math, but I don't get to opt out of math just because I don't like it, right? And so, again, it's not so much a matter of denying a constitutional right as saying that if you're willing to access a public education, this is the entirety of the public education. Other thoughts or comments?
Well, I'll just comment on that. This is really a critical question and an issue that we grapple with in the community, because obviously we all want accountability for our schools. We want our schools to be great, and we want to be able to show that. And so we have to work with the state board to ensure that we're developing an instrument that really does measure that, so then we can also assess our schools and make sure they're performing up to our standards and the high standards that our community expects. But obviously this is a challenge that we hope that we can continue to work with parents, community members, teachers, and administrators to talk about how do we make this actually more relevant so that it's not something that parents feel the need to opt out of.
Well, and I would just add that that's why I'm so excited that the Every Student Succeeds Act allows for multiple measures of student success and school quality. And that really, I think, is a huge improvement over a single test on a single day, and really is going to allow us to have a much deeper and better conversation about the many ways in which our schools serve their students well.
Okay, thank you. The reading level of some of the language art test questions has been found to be several grades above the tested grade. How is it that a child cannot read at the grade level and can't understand text or the test questions, but be expected to still complete the test?
So it is an unfortunate reality that some kids come in not reading at grade level, and teachers do a phenomenal job of trying to get them up to grade level or even past grade level. The test is meant to measure their mastery of grade level content and standards. Now, the issue with the text of the question being above the grade level is one that, again, I'm sure people feel that, but there is a lot of work and a lot of review that goes into these test questions. They're written by actual grade level educators. They're not written by people in some room by themselves. They're written by teachers. And then they go through a lot of review to make sure that they are on grade level. And if too many students get an item wrong when it's field tested, they don't use it. So, I mean, I'm not going to disagree with it, but I'm going to suggest that it may be that grade level content is not always being taught in the classroom. And I do know that's the case. Before I came to assessment, I worked in school improvement. And I used to go into schools and I would look into the classroom, and the first thing that I would look for is whether or not grade level instruction was occurring. And in far too many places, that is not the case. A 4th grade class should not be reading redfish, bluefish. You know, I'm sorry, that's just not grade level instruction and it's not grade level text.
We had a number of questions about the security of the test and data leaks and student information being protected. So can you speak to how we handle that at State Board?
Sure, absolutely. So there are several, both federal and state laws that demand that we protect student identifiable information with the highest degree of security. So all of the systems that we use at ISBE and all of the systems that any of our testing vendors are required to use have to adhere to the highest industry standard protocols. Now, I'm not going to say that nothing can ever happen to that data, right? We know that that's just not the world we live in. But there has, to my knowledge, never been a breach, and I would know, because the vendors would be required to disclose it to me immediately if it were to happen. And it would be a huge violation of their contracts. You would have seen it in every headline if student information had somehow been hacked from one of our assessment vendors, because that would invalidate their contract. It would open them up to millions and millions and millions of dollars in liability. And quite frankly, if it ever did happen, or God forbid they actually did something as crazy as selling student data, they would never, ever get another state contract in any state in this country, because we are so protective of that student data. So I'm not gonna sit here and be an advocate for Pearson. That's not my job, I don't work for them. My job is to hold them accountable for protecting the student information. And all I can say is it's in their own best interest that they treat student data as if it is the precious, priceless cargo that it is.
I guess I just have 2 follow-ups on that. One, in the RFP, is security of the data, proprietary, ownership of the data covered, and 2, is it also covered in the contract?
Absolutely. So just to share a little bit about the Park Consortium contract, the data is secure, and only the state all of the data belongs to the state, not to the vendor. And I can't see Maryland's data, I can't see DC's data, because I don't have any rights to see their data. And they can't see Illinois'. Just because we're in a partnership together doesn't give us any rights to each other's data. And there have actually been several times where we've wanted to do a collaborative study and couldn't get past the mutual data sharing agreements in order to do it. So again, this is very securely protected, and it's covered in both the RFP and in the contracts in multiple places. Great question.
We also received a number of questions about the NWEA assessment. So Ray, can you kind of speak to that? And we know that a lot of districts are using it on top of the Park assessment, and kind of just the lay of the land on that.
Yeah, absolutely. So like I said, no test can be all things to all people. And NWEA is an incredibly popular test for a number of reasons. It's a diagnostic test, so it's meant to help teachers understand what grade level a student is actually at. So it can scale down as low as it needs to go, it can go up as high as it can. And that's really very helpful to teachers when they want to differentiate their instruction, right? They want to know where a student's gaps are. The other thing that they can do is they can use that test multiple times a year. Again, it's interesting. We get this question a lot. Why can't we just use NWEA as our state's assessment? And the simple answer is it does not meet federal guidelines. In fact, multiple states have tried to make NWEA their state test, and it has been rejected 3 times by the federal government. It does not fully sample grade level content. It does not provide the same test to the same students. And those are the things that are the requirements under federal assessment guidelines. It's the same reason that Smarter Balance, which is another computer adaptive test, hasn't been fully recognized yet, because at the core, what these tests, these accountability assessments are supposed to do is to measure mastery of the breadth and depth of grade level content. So a test that's constantly shifting on and off grade level doesn't do that sufficiently well for the federal standards. So again, it's a really good test for schools to use to diagnose a student's sort of educational level, gives them some good information about their growth over time, but it simply does not meet the federal assessment guidelines.
So I think that goes to a point that that we need to think about, and I think that as a legislative body, we need to think about talking to our federal representatives about, as they consider federal law, is that an opportunity for us to advocate to the federal government about what we want and what we believe would be better for students? Because obviously there's a concern that if we're using multiple assessments, right, if we're using one to measure grade level and then we're using another diagnostic, we're taking more time out of the classroom. And yes, the state required test is limited time, but if the districts are adding other tests, then it's taking more time out of the classroom, so that's a concern. And so is that perhaps something that we should be advocating, and perhaps at the federal level with our representatives federally for a change in federal law? Would that resolve some of those issues that we're facing?
Well, again, I think you got to go back to that no one test is going to do all things for all people, and there are always going to be multiple needs for information about what students know. I think the bigger issue here is that we need to be building the assessment literacy of teachers so that they don't have to rely on these kinds of diagnostic products that they're buying from vendors, but rather that they're able to build authentic assessments in their own classroom. Because again, the best quality assessment is one that is actually indistinguishable from high quality instruction. It should be so sort of embedded and so similar to day-to-day instruction that a student shouldn't really know that they're taking a test. It should just be a part of their regular experience in the classroom. Now, a state summative test is never going to be perfectly like that, but again, when teachers are better able to build assessments that are similarly rigorous, that have the same kinds of design qualities, the problem is it's just not what any of us went to school for. It wasn't what I was taught when I was going through my education preparation program. It's not something that we teach really well. And so there's lots of different ways that I think we can go about building better assessments. Obviously, national changes to law are one great way to start, but there's also a lot we can do in terms of teacher preparation, professional development for teachers, and things like that.
We also have a lot of questions. I'm going to keep opening with that. Your questions tend to be on the same subject. So 95% and the participation rate, and the questions are all the way from punishment of districts, how is that reported from the district to the school. So Ray, can you kind of talk on all that, and then if you miss anything, I'll make sure I can jump in.
Sounds great. Yeah, oh boy, 95% participation. So the federal law is actually requires assessment of all students, not just 95% of them. 95% is considered the threshold for adequate testing. And it's considered the threshold above which we can have some confidence in what we know about how schools are doing in terms of educating their kids. Because obviously, if you're missing a huge chunk of your student population, you really don't know, one way or the other, how well you're actually doing serving those kids. And this is, to me, and I've come to feel rather passionately about this, oddly enough, a deep issue of equity. And I certainly think that educators are just the best people in the world, and I am sad to realize that there have been instances where schools have attempted to systemically exclude kids from accountability. There were certain kids they just didn't want counted. And that attitude has shifted so much over the last 10 years. I don't think we would have that same issue now, but we have had it in the past. And so again, the 95% threshold is not just for all students, it's also for specific federally required demographic groups: racial, gender, students with disabilities, English learners, migrant, low income, things like that. And that's important because we need to know if schools are serving all of their students well. And it makes me really sad to realize that one of the groups that frequently falls below the 95% threshold is the students with disabilities, because that's the kids that need our protection and need our advocacy the most. And so that's one where I I directly kind of draw this line of I can't possibly, be an advocate for better services if I don't know, if I can't say this school is not serving their student population well. So with respect to the 95% testing threshold, in the past it was a one-year thing. It's always been based on the regular and the alternate assessment in reading, language arts, and mathematics. And it will be that moving forward, because that is what is required in the ESSA law. Now, it is permissible for states to include more. Some states do. Certainly, I think you could read our ESSA plan and have a question about whether or not we were going to include science or access or some of those other tests that we talked about. But we try to hew pretty closely to the law, and the law says reading, language arts, and mathematics. So in grades 3 through 8, that would be the PARCC and the DLM, Illinois Assessment of Readiness moving forward. At the high school, it would be whatever our high school's test will be, and the DLM. And if a place had, if a school was an actual K-12 school, then they would have PARCC, they would have whatever the high school test is, and they would have their DLM. So those are the tests that factor into that 95% participation. Each kid counts one time per subject, and it is by subject. The reason it's by subject is that there are a rare few kids who don't take both subjects. If a child is homeschooled but receives, for example, their advanced math classes at the high school, then they would take the math test, they wouldn't take the ELA test, because that school is not responsible for that student's ELA instruction, right? So they take the assessment for the instruction that they are receiving. So and really, no kid takes more than one test per subject. They either take the regular test, or they are a student who is eligible to take that alternate test, and they take the alternate test. I do want to clarify, it is permissible for a kid who takes that alternate test, who also wants to take the state's accountability assessment, because they want that free college entrance exam, right? That's a real benefit to a student. They absolutely can, but we only count them once for participation. So again, we calculate that. Historically, that's really kind of what we did with it. We did it, and we sent it off to the feds, and we did a number of things to sort of intervene in places that fell below the 95% testing threshold. It used to be that you didn't meet your AYP target. You couldn't be, you couldn't meet your AYP target if you didn't meet the 95% threshold. Used to be that we would require corrective action plans, things like that. Moving forward, what we are going to do is we're actually going to start looking at a 3 consecutive year trend, right? One of the things that changed in ESSA was that we dropped the size of the student group that you had to have in order for that group to show up in the accountability system. It used to be 40, it's gone down to 20. What that means on a practical level is that if your student group is 20 students big and one kid is out sick, you're at the 95%. You'd be fine because you're at 95, but boy, 2 kids come out sick and that's a problem, right? We know that. But, so that's the benefit of a 3-year trend, right? Because you have a bad flu year, that's a bad flu year. 3 years in a row, that's a trend, and that requires some intervention. Now, there's, I've been fielding a lot of questions over the past few weeks about which 3 years are we going to use. You could absolutely read the plan. We said in the plan we were going to start notification in 18-19, and it was going to be based on 3 consecutive years. Any logical person would read that and say, well, it's probably going to be 16, 17, and 18, right? We have been really debating this. As we implement the ESSA plan, we are working very hard to make sure that things are coherent, that they're working. There's so many different streams of work that are going on in this law. And every so often we come up against something and go, does this make the most sense? So literally just yesterday, we sat down and tackled this and came to the conclusion that yes, we are going to notify schools if they have a school below, or pardon me, a student group below the 95% threshold. But starting this year, this is going to be the start of those 3 consecutive years. So there wouldn't be a school. Now, there have absolutely been communications out there that have said the 16, 17, 18. Those were not wrong. They were perfectly valid. This was literally a decision that was made yesterday. to go with 18, 19, and 20. Now, so then the question is, we're notifying them. The consequence of having a student or a student group be below that 99% threshold is that you are identified for something called targeted supports and interventions. I'm going to use an acronym again, TSI, targeted supports and interventions. There's a little bit of confusion around this, and again, perfectly valid interpretation of the way the plan was written. There's a lot of confusion of that with something called a Tier 3. Every year, a school receives a summative designation, Tier 1, 2, 3, or 4, based off of all of the indicators in the accountability system. It's not just 95%. In fact, that's not really even one of the indicators. It's just kind of a decision point in the tiering. It's academic performance, it's student growth, it's culture and climate, it's all of those indicators. And if you ever want me to talk about the indicators, I'll go on for days. But it's all those things, and that summative rating is given every single year. Places that are below that 95% cannot be Tier 1, because again, we can't really know for sure if they deserve that designation, if they aren't really testing all their kids, right? They might have a group, like their special education students, that are just not being as well served. But they can be any of the other tiers. They can absolutely be a Tier 2, and absolutely be a Tier 3, right? They have a targeted issue that needs targeted support and intervention. So, 3 consecutive years, they get that TSI designation, but it's not going to affect where they fall in the tiers, other than that it means they can't be Tier 1. Again, the tiers have very specific meanings. Tier 4 means that you are in the bottom performing 5% of schools statewide. Tier 3 are schools that have a student group that is performing at or below the performance level of that all student group of the bottom performing 5%, right? Because it's pretty serious if you have a student group that is performing on par with the bottom performing 5% of schools in the states. Tier 1 is the top 10% of schools' performance on all of the indicators statewide, and then Tier 2 is kind of everybody else. Okay. All right. What are the consequences? So what happens if you get that TSI designation? The thing is, you'll be required to do a TSI plan, right? A targeted support and intervention plan. And so I think one version of this question that I've heard is, well, so is that going to pull money away or time away? And my answer to that is possibly, maybe, because obviously time and effort is going to have to be put into building the plan and then actually implementing the plan to address the issue. But that can range, and it should range. And certainly, whatever plan gets put in place shouldn't be taking time away from instruction, but rather building it. So again, hypothetically, I'm picking on students with disabilities a lot, but let's just say that school noticed that was their population, that they weren't testing sufficiently. And as they start to look into what's really causing that, maybe they discover that part of the reason that they don't want to assess the kids is because they don't have proper grade level instruction occurring in those special education classrooms. And they are supposed to be providing grade level instruction even to all students with disabilities. You're not supposed to lower the content and the rigor, you're supposed to appropriately scaffold it. And so again, maybe they discover that they need to provide some intensive professional development to their teachers. They discover they might need to get a better aligned curriculum. That is going to divert resources to those things, but ultimately it's of benefit to the students that they do so, right? So again, I'm going to give a certified maybe on that. It really depends on the school and the situation, and that's appropriate. We want people to be implementing plans that are targeted directly to their local context.
What if the district's best and brightest are up enough instead of just disabled students?
Do you mind if we can give you a card you can write on that? We're going to try to get through all the questions given the limited amount of time. Okay, there is also some questions about online testing and resources at schools if they do not have the technology to support the online test.
Great question, and one that I'm intimately familiar with. I used to work with a school down in southern Illinois, and one day they called me and they were calling from their cell phones, and I said, why are you calling from your cell phones? And they said, well, It rained really hard yesterday, and I said, okay, what does that have to do with why you're calling me from your cell phone? And they said, well, when it rains too hard, the phones don't work. I'm like, wait, your landline phones don't work when it rains too hard? They're like, yep. So, believe me, I completely get the sort of deep differences in resource access in this state. And having said all of that, I agree with Dr. Smith when he says that, quite frankly, digital literacy skills are fundamentally necessary for a student to be college and career ready. And one of the ways that we sort of encourage schools to direct resources to providing technology is by requiring online assessment. And I actually do agree with that. Because again, then the question becomes, well, wait, we have these machines, but we only ever pull them out to take the test. And my response is, well, okay, then you're not using the machines properly. Like, again, the daily instruction should always match the assessment as closely as possible. It's the same thing that we say when we provide students accommodations on a test. You shouldn't give a student something for a test that they don't use in their regular daily instruction. It's just going to distract them, it's just going to confuse them. It's actually probably going to hinder them rather than help them. So if yours is a school where you have a giant thing of Chromebooks that only gets pulled out once a year, you are massively underserving your students. Those kids should be using those machines every single day. That is just, again, just have them pull out and write. Because again, so much of the assessment is on their ability to write. So it doesn't matter. You don't have to change your instruction radically to do that. Now, I completely understand that there are places that do not have as much funding to go to technology. I'm just going to own that. But the passage of the evidence-based funding bill, I think, will really help to address that moving forward. Again, I don't think we can move to 100% online assessment in the next year or two, but really within 3 years, we've got to get there because it's just a critical skill. There is practically no one whose job does not require interfacing with a computer to some degree. Heck, I don't think you can apply to work at Walmart anymore without filling out an online form. So it's just essential.
One of the challenges, and I think something I hear in the community, you talked about instruction matching assessment, and I think one of the challenges that I hear in the community and from the educator community is that the assessment, they don't feel that the assessment is actually very relevant to their students, and that we're allowing, that this assessment doesn't allow them to tailor the curriculum to ensure that the students are getting the best learning opportunities, whether that be for students with disabilities or high-achieving students. I think that's one of the challenges that I hear. And so when you say something like daily instruction should match assessment, okay, that makes sense. But then when you feel the assessment isn't really relevant or helpful to the students that I'm trying to teach, or this, my student, if you're a parent, I think that's one of the challenges that I hear consistently from the community. And so I think that's something I'd like to have a little bit more.
Yeah, no, I totally get that. So here's where I sit. I'll go back. I'm going to talk more about my experience with my schools before I came to assessment than about the assessment itself. The assessment is well aligned to the standards. It's not always clear to me that instruction is well aligned to the standards. And instruction that is well aligned to the standards can be unbelievably creative, unbelievably wide-ranging and cross-curricular. In fact, it should be, because again, the things that the assessment is measuring that are not part of the traditional curriculum are those deep critical thinking skills. It's those writing skills. It's the ability to deeply engage with a text and then not just pull out details like who the protagonist was, but to actually say something about why the protagonist acts the way he or she does based off of textual evidence. It's the ability to engage with essentially nonfiction texts, which again, we know is not something that was happening in a lot of curriculum beforehand, but just because something is nonfiction doesn't mean it has to be boring or dry. It doesn't have to necessarily be a science textbook. It can be the Constitution, it can be the newspaper, it can be, there's all kinds of wonderful nonfiction texts that are out there. And the great part about the standards is that there are so many different ways to teach them. Again, the whole concept with the standards was that we move away from this, mile wide, inch deep, tons of things you have to hit here and there, and instead have the ability to go deep on some core skills and core knowledge, but have many, many, many different ways of accessing those skills and knowledge. And so, again, I sort of think back to the schools that I've watched go through this process, and teachers really have to work very, very, very hard to understand the standards and to really translate them into their teaching practices. And that is not a knock on teachers. They do this work, and it is phenomenal to see them do it. But it's hard work. They need time, they need support, they need professional development. And so, again, I think that if a teacher, sure, nobody loves the test, but if they're saying that it's not relevant, then I would say, have you really looked at the questions? Because they are great questions. I could teach entire units around just a couple of the questions that I see. And they really challenge you to raise your expectations for your students.
Could I also just discuss, I know we're running short of time, but I want to discuss the recent news. We said there was, we're retaining the PARC questions, but there's an RFP out there. And could you explain what that really means practically for what teachers and students can expect?
Sure. Well, it goes back to that thing that I said about the test is supposed to measure the standards. Instruction is supposed to be aligned to the standards. The PARC items are really well aligned to those standards. They measure them very well. That's the reason it's been federally recognized. So we want to take those items. PARC puts them together in one way. Those are called test forms, right? They put their units together. The units are of a particular length. They follow something called a blueprint. Just like you have a blueprint for your house, they have a blueprint for a test. And that blueprint makes sure that they cover everything. We essentially want to play with the blueprint a little bit. Much like you can pick a 3-story house or a 2-story house, we want to be able to play with the blueprint of our test. We absolutely still want to have those PARC items because they are just incredible quality. When you talk to teachers and they talk about the test items, they're like, yeah, I don't like the test, but the questions are pretty great. That's what we want to build on. We want to keep that, but we want to have the ability to put them together in new and different ways in order to achieve what we talked about, that more rapid return of results, that ability to potentially add questions to the bank so that we could make it computer adaptive. All of that's going to take time, though. The test is not going to change dramatically from year to year. It can't. We want to be able to maintain that comparability so that we have that longitudinal data. And the way that you get that comparability is you have a common set of items across the years. So these changes will be phased in slowly over time, and that's important to teachers because they shouldn't have to change their instruction just because the test is changing. The test is aligned to the standards, instruction should be aligned to the standards. As long as those things are happening, the test will always be measuring what teachers are doing.
And very briefly, we'll get back to you, but in terms of that longitudinal data, we recently switched from the ACT to the SAT in high schools. So how do we have that data? And you mentioned that there's going to be another RFP. So if we say switch back to the ACT, do we still have some of that comparable data?
No, we don't, and it's a tragedy at high school. I'm going to be very honest, we do not have good quality longitudinal data at high school. It's the reason that rather than having student growth, we have high school graduation rates as 50% of their overall system. It's just really unfortunate, and I'm going to be very honest. Again, the issue with PARC at high school in Illinois was not the test. It was the way Illinois was administering the test. It's still being used quite effectively in other states at the high school level, but in Illinois, we gave districts the choice of which grades to assess, and that put us out of compliance with the federal regulations. It's supposed to be the same test to the same students at the same time, and that was not how we were administering it. Now, that was based off of budgetary decisions that were made at the time, not by ISBE, but by the legislature. We couldn't afford to give it the way we were supposed to. And so, I'm going to say we made the best choices we could at the time, but they have had consequences, and the consequence is that lack of longitudinal data. We were very fortunate that we had a test like the SAT that had been procured for completely separate reasons. It was just to provide a free college entrance exam to all students in the state. It was never procured to be our accountability assessment, but we were able to use it as such. And now that we have that flexibility to use a nationally recognized college entrance exam as the state assessment, that flexibility there in ESSA, we see the benefit of doing that. We were able to provide a free college entrance exam to all students during the school day, and we get the accountability assessment.
Can you speak to the scoring of the assessments on the computer when it's science or written, and how those are scored and how that varies?
Yeah, so that's actually really cool. So that is one of the cool things to have come out of an otherwise less than fabulous science exam. We have a really innovative science scoring system. Anything that is machine scored is machine scored, and there's a whole bunch of techie reports if you really want to read them on how machine scoring happens. But with the human scored items, those are passed to actual educators, Illinois educators who are trained at SIU Carbondale. They don't have to be residing in that area, they can be statewide, and in fact we've had several people start to get trained, and they log into a very, very secure system. They grade the items according to a rubric that they've been trained on. We have what's called a read-through that then checks to make sure that a second scorer would score it the same way. And they grade as many of those items as they choose, so it's one of those things that if they want to do a ton, they can do a ton. If they only have time to do a few, they get paid by the items that they grade. And it is really a phenomenal process. And the people who've gone through it and have started to learn how to grade these items are coming back to us saying, this is fantastic, because I'm starting to take these things back into my classroom and starting to, integrate what I've learned into my classroom. So we are really interested in seeing how we can potentially build that kind of a system out on the reading and math side, because again, the more we can educate our teachers on assessments and on assessment literacy, the better off everyone is.
And then also to the writing portion of the park exam, how that is scored when it's done on the computer.
Sure, again, those go to actual human beings, and roughly the same process is followed. No, they really do. They really do. They go to human beings. I know, because we also get something called, now there are some that are scored through AI. We've been developing the ability to machine score, essentially written items. And I will be, Eric Iverson is a great guy. He's our ELA guy, and he says that he was the most skeptical that a machine could score those written response items well. And even he, who is just really kind of tech phobic, is coming around to the fact that they really can do a pretty amazing job. But they are read by humans, and the reason I know that is that there are also something called student distress that we get, student distress alerts. So if ever a student writes something that would indicate that they are being abused, that they are a threat to themselves or others, that someone maybe is hurting them or bullying them, we actually get an alert, and then we inform the schools. So it's one of those things. It's not just a machine reading them. It really is people, and they're grading, but they're also reviewing the actual content of the items. So that if there was ever anything, because sometimes kids use that as an opportunity to kind of cry for help, and we want to make sure that they're getting that help.
it's 8 o'clock. We have lots and lots of questions, so I kind of leave it. I know, like you said, it's a school night and a work night.
Well, I know we do have a lot of questions, but, are there any, so we could do, a couple rapid fire, or, probably not. And we know this is a really, really challenging topic, and in-depth. And I think that it's really critical, and really critical that we have so many people here that are sharing these questions, because I know that we're getting feedback as well, not just questions. I mean, I know many of your questions are informed by your experiences, your opinions, your thoughts. And so we are seeing that, and I know ISBE is seeing that, and I think I really appreciate the opportunity that we've had to really have this dialogue, because I think our representatives from ISBE need to know that this is not just a handful of people. This is something a lot of people are concerned about in our community. And so I really think this is really critical. And I would just want to say thank you to our representative from ISBE for taking the time to come to Downers Grove and to have this dialogue with us. Before I close and hand it over to Senator Curran to close, I want to remind you, April is Child Abuse Prevention Awareness Month. This is an important month. We kicked off the month this morning with DCFS and many faith groups in Chicago at Fourth Presbyterian Church. And I just want to remind people that if you do see signs of child abuse, it's incumbent upon all of us to speak up, to report that to the authorities, to reach out to whether it's law enforcement, to DCFS. That is really critical, and I think it's important that we remember that during this month, and especially around this topic of education. So Senator Curran, I'll hand it over to you for closing remarks.
I just want to thank everyone for coming out tonight. This is, a tremendous turnout, which really a lot of work goes into putting this on, and you make that well worthwhile with your attendance here. So please follow up with questions. We want to ensure that every question gets answered. So please follow up with questions. And
We posted those questions, we posted somewhere.
Will you provide written answers to the questions that we haven't had time to answer?
Yeah, why don't we do that?
we'll compile and yes, we'll compile and because we want to share like we did tonight in a collaborative manner. Written answers will be to every question, will be posted, so that way you have one resource. Okay, so thank you everyone, and I want to most especially thank Ray and Sarah, and happy birthday, Ray. Everyone,